In 1960 Houston, young George and his family move into a dilapidated house without electricity. One evening, George's mother divides a single hamburger among her 4 starving children. George reluctantly waits for prayer before quickly eating his share. His sister Mary, always seeing the best in him, offers George half of her portion. That night, their mother emphasizes the importance of George avoiding fights at school to prevent him from being held back another year. The next day at school, George's appearance draws stares. In class, the teacher dismisses his attempt to answer a question due to his dirty clothes. At lunch, George sits alone without food. A classmate taunts him, leading George to punch the boy in the face and flee as the teacher arrives. George reflects on his anger as his go-to response and his inability to stop fighting, seeing it as his only strength. Years later, George and a friend attempt to rob a drunk man outside a bar who turns out to be an undercover police officer in a sting operation. George escapes the ensuing police chase by hiding under a house, covering himself in sewage to avoid detection by a police dog. On his way home, George sees a Job Corps advertisement offering free food, vocational training, and pay to students. Excited, George shares this with his mother, who supports his decision, urging him to finish what he starts. A few days later, George arrives at the Job Corps in California, where a guard explains the rules. Inside, he immediately clashes with Desmond over a bed. George finds new sneakers and a note from his mother in his duffel bag, which Desmond eyes enviously. During an electrical class, George's struggles amuse other students, and he responds with a tough look, accustomed to using strength to resolve issues. The next day, George, frustrated by Desmond playing music while he tries to study, unplugs the record player. Desmond offers him a drink, which George declines, but they begin to bond. George's mood brightens when Desmond invites him to the chow hall. However, he discovers his new sneakers are missing. Desmond advises him to report the theft after they eat and reveals his knack for numbers, having tweaked cafeteria orders to include more brownies. George then spots a guy wearing his stolen sneakers, who upon seeing George's glare, flees and locks himself in his dorm room. Undeterred, George breaks down the door and nearly throws the thief out the window before Doc intervenes and breaks up the fight. Outside, George tries to justify his actions, explaining his mother's hard work to buy the shoes. Doc gives George 2 choices, jail or going home, citing 3 assaults and a broken door during George's time there. Doc offers bus fare, ready to expel him, but George pleads, stating the institution is all he has. Doc, feeling sympathetic, gives him another chance, asking if George has ever boxed. George mentions street fights, but Doc, a boxing coach, explains boxing is a sport with rules. Noticing George's strength, Doc suggests he join the boxing club, which George eagerly accepts. The next day at the gym, Doc introduces George to his sparring partner. George reacts aggressively to jokes, but Doc reminds him they are not there to kill each other. As George enters the ring, Desmond offers spectators a chance to bet on the match. George's lack of technique makes him an easy target, and he is quickly knocked down, drawing laughter. Humiliated, George storms out and punches a bag so hard it falls, silencing everyone. In the locker room, Doc calms George, explaining his opponent was once as inexperienced as George and that proper training can help him reach the same level. Doc urges George to ignore others' opinions and focus on training, beginning rigorous instruction in boxing techniques and tactics. George finds footwork and coordination challenging, but Doc emphasizes the strategic aspect of boxing. One day, George calls home. The conversation goes well until he mentions learning to box. His mother disapproves of fighting, but George insists it's a sport with rules. Their call abruptly ends when George runs out of phone credit. Later, George faces the same opponent who knocked him down before, but this time, George knocks him out within seconds, impressing Doc. George visits Doc's office and learns Doc was a professional boxer. George shows Doc a magazine article about Joe Frazier and declares his ambition to become world champion. Doc advises temperance, explaining the extensive training required for professional competition. When George asks about the next Olympics, Doc states he won't be ready for 5 years, despite his powerful punch. The scene shifts to the following summer. 19-year-old George, having trained for only 1 year, faces an experienced Soviet boxer. Commentators doubt his chances, but his family watches proudly from home, glued to the TV. Everyone at the Job Corps rallies behind George, and even his mother, despite reservations about the violence, watches with her children. George delivers several decisive blows, winning the gold medal effortlessly. His victory brings mixed emotions for for his mother, who struggles with the sport's violence, while an ecstatic George hoists the American flag. His siblings watch in awe, hardly believing their brother won his first Olympic gold medal at such a young age. The day after his victory, George proudly wears his gold medal while strolling through his neighborhood. He encounters a former accomplice who criticizes him for raising the American flag, contrasting it with the protest of other black athletes who bowed their heads on the podium, accusing George of disrespecting their cause. Frustrated, George goes to his mother, venting about being labeled a sellout. She soothes him, and bolstered by her support, George vows to win the championship belt to earn everyone's respect. At the airport, George spots a stunning girl reading a sports magazine with him on the cover. He approaches her, and they converse. Her name is Paula. As her flight is announced, George tries to get her number, and she tells him to write his phone number, leaving him slightly flustered. George mumbles to himself about her not being the type to wait by the phone. Back at the gym, Doc introduces George to his new team: Dick Sadler, his promoter, and Archie Moore, a former light heavyweight champion. George embarks on his quest for the heavyweight title, defeating opponents one by one, each victory bringing him closer to his goal. Under his coach's guidance, he prepares to face Joe Frazier. Meanwhile, Paula calls George, and they begin dating. She becomes a regular at his fights, supporting him as his record improves to 22-0. Eventually, George and Paula get married. After securing his 36th win, George's coaches announce he is ready for the title fight. The big day arrives in Jamaica for the title fight between George Foreman and Joe Frazier. George is the underdog, especially since Frazier defeated Muhammad Ali 2 years prior. And few believe George stands a chance. The crowd fervently chants for Frazier. George takes a heavy left hook early in the first round but responds with powerful body shots. Frazier lands another signature left hook, but just before the round ends, George delivers a massive uppercut, knocking Frazier down. The bell rings, giving Frazier crucial recovery time. Undeterred, George dominates the subsequent rounds, knocking Frazier down several times until the referee stops the fight. To everyone's astonishment, George is declared the new heavyweight champion of the world. At the after-party, George is surrounded by cheers and journalists. A charming woman catches his eye. He approaches Desmond, offering him a role as his financial manager, acknowledging Desmond's knack for numbers. Impressed, Desmond agrees, pouring out his drink as George insists he stop drinking. Later, George finds the same woman in his hotel room. Despite his confusion, he lets her stay, and they share an intimate moment, leaving George feeling deeply uncomfortable about having cheated on his wife. The next morning, George watches an interview where Muhammad Ali mocks him, vowing to throw him back into the ghetto with one punch. George is infuriated. A few months later, George hosts a family gathering at his luxurious mansion, proudly showing his mother his car collection. He is delighted to see his daughter, but his interactions with his wife are distant. As they are about to eat, his mother reminds everyone to thank God for the food. During the meal, his sister Mary announces her pregnancy, and Desmond shares that he has invested all George's money into rock-solid stocks. Meanwhile, Paula answers a phone call, discovering it's one of George's mistresses. She confronts George, who avoids eye contact. George then travels to the Democratic Republic of Congo to fight Muhammad Ali. In this country, Ali is revered, and almost everyone supports him. At the hotel, George encounters Ali entertaining celebrities with a stand-up routine mocking George. Ali claims sports writers will regret underestimating him. When George approaches, the audience anticipates a response, but he walks away in silence, leaving Ali to continue captivating spectators. Due to Ali's immense popularity, the crowd chants, "Ali Boma Ye," meaning Ali, kill him. Despite this, commentators speculate that after Foreman's dominating performance against Frazier, Ali seems unlikely to win. As the fight begins, George takes control, landing significant punches while Ali attempts to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ali's continuous taunts fuel George's anger. Throughout the fight, George aggressively pushes Ali against the ropes, delivering powerful punches. Ali demonstrates defensive prowess, managing to counterattack periodically. However, George's aggressive style gradually drains his energy, visibly tiring him as the rounds progress, while Ali remains relatively fresh. During a break, Dick and Archie urge George to maintain pressure, but Doc is concerned by this advice, noticing George's increasing fatigue. By the 8th round, Foreman is exhausted, and Ali begins to dominate, landing forceful punches and eventually knocking Foreman down. Ali wins the fight by knockout, marking Foreman's first defeat, and the audience expresses admiration admiration for Ali. After his defeat, George reevaluates his life, realizing his aggressive nature had blinded him. He decides to make amends, calling his wife and vowing to never leave her side again. However, Paula, feeling detached and hurt, asks him to sign divorce papers instead. Seeking comfort, George visits his mother and confesses to dismissing Dick and Archie, blaming them for his loss. His mother supports his decision. Later, to prove his strength and regain pride, George decides to fight 5 boxers in one day, a rationale that baffles everyone. Doc urges him to abandon this reckless idea. During the event, Muhammad Ali joins the commentators, mocking George. As the fight progresses, Ali captures the crowd's attention, who chant his name. Frustrated, George challenges Ali to a rematch, sparking an argument. Despite distractions, George completes his daunting challenge, defeating all 5 fighters and knocking out 3, demonstrating his enduring strength. After the fight, Doc confronts George in the dressing room, questioning his motives for fighting 5 opponents and advising him to return to fighting opponents one at a time. Their conversation is interrupted by a message for George, who rushes to the hospital, learning his pregnant sister Mary has started bleeding and was urgently hospitalized. George insists on paying for the best doctors, but is told the baby needs a miracle and they need to pray. Overwhelmed, George steps outside to pray, asking God why Mary's baby would be chosen when she is the kindest person he knows, pleading for his own life to be taken instead if a life must be. The next morning, George is awakened by his mother. They go to Mary's room and find her with a healthy baby, a miracle doctors cannot explain. Mary tells him she knew he prayed to God, and it worked. In the next scene, George struggles during a fight against Jimmy Young, ultimately losing by unanimous decision. In the dressing room, a coach criticizes George, telling him he's lost his chance at a rematch with Muhammad Ali. Overwhelmed and suffering from heat stroke, George hears a voice and collapses, losing consciousness. When he wakes, Doc informs him they thought he was dead. George finds faith, stating, "Jesus Christ is alive in me." A few days later, George is baptized. Soon after, he nervously speaks at a church, telling the congregation how he found God. Spotting a girl in the audience who listens intently, he finds his calm. He declares his intention to dedicate his life to God and become a preacher, surprising and shocking Doc. Doc is skeptical of George's sudden change, suspecting it might be for show, and feels deeply upset about his decision. George likens his decision to Doc trading one uniform for another. Next, George visits Muhammad Ali. Ali continues to joke about him, but George reveals he was once so angry he wanted to kill Ali, but now seeks forgiveness. Ali tries to entice him into a rematch, suggesting he fight Kenny Norton one more time. George reassures him it's not a joke, and after a heartfelt conversation, they reconcile and eventually become friends. George then visits his ex-wife and children, apologizing sincerely for his past behavior. During his next visit to the church, he approaches the girl he noticed before and strikes up a conversation. She finds it hard to believe a former boxer could truly transform into a preacher. In response, George takes a microphone outside the church to preach and inspire passers-by to follow God. Although some mock him, he remains calm, demonstrating his growth in handling anger. The girl watches, impressed by his sincerity. Later, during lunch, she apologizes for doubting him, explaining his reputation made her skeptical. But now, seeing his true intentions, she introduces herself as Mary. They discover a mutual attraction. George drives her to an old abandoned church, sharing his dream of buying it to establish his own congregation. 7 years later, George's dream has come true, and he preaches in his own church, supported by his wife Mary and their children. After a service, a woman approaches him with her grandson, asking George to train the boy, who has fallen in with a bad crowd. George declines, suggesting they find guidance in the Bible instead. A week later, while playing with his kids, George sees a news report that the boy was arrested for committing a crime. He feels deep regret for not agreeing to train him. George discovers an old building ideal for his plans and instructs his financial manager to purchase it. Desmond is still struggling with drinking problems. They renovate the space, and within months, the gym thrives with students. George hires coaches and dedicates a section as the Muhammad Ali study hall. However, a year after opening, the electricity suddenly goes out during a class, and the power company reveals no payments have been received. Worse, Desmond is missing. Frantic, George visits the bank and learns Desmond invested all his money in high-risk stocks that have now tanked, leaving his investment account empty. The bank threatens to repossess his property, including his mother's house. Enraged, George searches for Desmond. Despite his anger, his mother urges him to forgive Desmond. George eventually finds Desmond in a bar and nearly kills him, but realizing what he is doing, he forgives Desmond. To salvage his financial situation, George stars in a sauce commercial and sells merchandise. merchandise. Despite these efforts, his wife Mary informs him they are still far from resolving their financial crisis. As the bank begins to seize his property, George sinks into depression. He dusts off his old boxing gear, trying to reconnect with his past. He confides in Mary that he has asked a friend to give the upcoming sermon in his place, feeling he can't preach on living rightly when he's lost everything. He wants to fight again, but Mary is against it, fearing his rage might return. George seeks out Doc, asking him to train him once more. Doc is initially resistant, reminiscing about how heartbroken he was when George quit, explaining how Joe Louis almost died trying to come back. George reassures him with words his coaches once told him about the air tasting different and two men mattering. Hearing this, Doc's eyes light up, and he says George needs to lose weight before they can train. Motivated, George struggles into his old gym clothes and begins training with his son. He has a hard time during workouts, but Mary unexpectedly helps him stick to his diet. After months of effort, George successfully makes weight and returns to Doc, ready to train fully. During a sparring session, George's speed is lacking, and he struggles to keep up, but Doc assures him they will adapt his style. In the middle of the night, Mary wakes from a vivid dream. In the morning, she tells George the Lord spoke to her in the dream, showing her a vision of George winning the heavyweight championship again. Before his comeback fight, Doc suggests they need George's old anger to win, but George insists on approaching the fight without rage. George enters the ring against Steve Zuski, admitting to Doc he's scared to take off his robe in front of people because of his changed appearance. Everyone notices George is overweight. As the fight begins, George acts too calmly, even holding back his anger after getting punched. In the second round, George begins to dominate, leaving no chance for Zuski. Seeing his opponent can't fight back, Foreman demands the referee stop the fight. News of George's triumphant return spreads, celebrating him as a hero to fat old bald guys everywhere, marking a remarkable comeback. After a streak of 24 wins, 42-year-old George Foreman faces reigning champion Evander Holyfield in a battle of the ages. Despite a valiant effort, George loses by unanimous decision. Post-fight, when he visits his bank, all the employees cheer for him. George is stunned by a $12 million payment from HBO for the fight. Despite the financial windfall, he tells Mary his job isn't over yet. 3 years later, Michael Moorer defeats Holyfield to win the title, and George, at 45, is a contender once again. No one believes George stands a chance against the 26-year-old Moorer, a powerhouse with 30 knockout wins and the first Southpaw heavyweight champion. Moorer's undefeated record and formidable prowess make him a daunting opponent. As the fight unfolds, Moorer dominates the early rounds, with George barely hanging on. Everyone at his gym, including his mother, roots for him. After the 9th round, his cornerman suggests he throw in the towel. However, in the 10th round, George lands a devastating right hand, knocking Moorer to the canvas. Against all odds, George Foreman wins the title, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in history. The movie reveals that at 45, George regained the heavyweight title after losing it 20 years prior. George and Muhammad Ali became great friends, speaking by phone almost every day for the rest of Ali's life. In 1998, Charles "Doc" Broaddus was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame. Today, George continues to preach at his church and run his youth center in Houston.